incredible flooding, completely wiped out one town and all kind of bridges. Asheville and other parts of western North Carolina were cut off from the world. What are some takeaways from this that the rest of us can learn from this?
The Ready Life, into the country.
Hi, I'm Nick Meisner.
And I'm Lisa, his wife.
And we want to welcome you back to the Ready Life podcast, where you'll learn how to become as independent as possible for basic necessities like water, food, heat, and the power that we so often depend on for these things. For those of you that haven't been tuning into the news and live elsewhere in the world or country, it really, really hit western North Carolina hard. Of course, it dumped a lot of rain everywhere. Yeah. I think I read that Atlanta got 11 inches in 48 hours,
wow,
which is a tremendous amount. And I'm sure it caused some flooding there, but the just devastating damage was done in western North Carolina, where you've got all of these valleys and all of this water up in the mountains was channeled into the valleys, when you've got massive amounts dumping. And so it's like gutters on a roof. You channel all the water from that roof into these little gutters, same thing. And just incredible flooding, completely wiped out one town and all kind of bridges.
Asheville too.
Yeah, Asheville was one. I've got a few quotes from some newspaper articles. Asheville and other parts of western North Carolina were cut off from the world on Saturday, with no roads open into or out of the most populous city in the region, and electricity and cell towers limited or inoperable. So you couldn't get in, couldn't get out. I read somewhere that they were having to fly in supplies, just basic necessity supplies. Another quote said, early Saturday morning, many gas stations were closed because they didn't have electricity, and the few that were open had hour-long lines wrapped around the block. Of course, that was several days ago. And then
maybe out of gas by now.
Yeah, if they haven't gotten their power back on, or trucks haven't gotten through, which, there's still a lot of flooding around and a lot of roads wiped out and things like this.
Yeah.
And another quote from a newspaper said, the city's water system was severely damaged, forcing residents to scoop creek water into buckets so they could flush toilets. We were watching a video of a guy in that area that they were doing all right. They didn't have power, but they were in the country and they had a well, and they did have a limited amount of gas on hand. And so they were running their generator a little bit just to run the water pump when they would need the water pump. But then his daughter had just had a surgery and her incision was getting infected and he needed some antibiotics, which meant he was going to have to go into Asheville. And apparently he was in an area where he could still get to the hospital somehow or other. Some directions he couldn't go because it was still flooded or roads wiped out. But somehow he was able to get to the hospital. When he got to the hospital, they couldn't help him because the prescription from the doctor was electronic, and they couldn't handle anything electronic because all, communications were down, cell phones were down, all of this kind of stuff. They needed a paper prescription
or patient in hand.
Right. Or else he was going to have to bring his daughter and check her into the hospital. And then he said that they were also, people were bringing, when they would come into the hospital, they were bringing 5-gallon buckets of creek water with them so that they could flush the toilets in the hospital if they were checked into the hospital. And there was like a big water truck that had pumped a bunch of water from the creek and was sitting next to the hospital. Just
quite something.
Yeah.
It's just so sad.
Continuing on with that article, it says people shared food and water and comforted one another in one neighborhood where a wall of water ripped away all the trees. Somerville Johnston planned on treating her neighborhood to venison stew from her powerless freezer before it goes bad. Another guy, volunteers were showing up. Mike Toberer decided to bring a dozen of his mules to deliver food, water, and diapers to hard-to-reach mountainous areas. We'll take our chainsaws and we'll push those mules through, he said.
Wow.
Noting that they could each carry 200 pounds.
Wow.
Yeah, it's getting pretty bad when you got to bring mules in to
To get through into
places.
the areas.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
so, and then even thinking about, I've seen some videos of some of the stuff that's washing down in these creeks,
Debris.
and it's like unearthly. I had read another article talking about that, and I wondered about it, but then I actually saw it with my own eyes. There's a sheen and smell of gas in the French Broad River. It's full of more trash than you've ever seen. It's full of sewage, gasoline, and propane tanks. I actually saw that on a video. Big old propane tank floating down the river.
Oh,
It's kind of got the full toxic stew of bad stuff you don't want in a river.
wow.
Yeah. So a really, really difficult situation, and nobody was prepared for it. I say nobody, very few people were prepared for it, because this was unlike any kind of scenario that they've dealt with in the foreseeable past.
Yeah.
And the events of this past week or so have been kind of vividly bringing back to my mind the summer of 1993. I remember we were living in Georgia at the time, and a historic flood came through, like nothing that I've ever seen before or since. It was a weird experience for us because, strangely enough, we still had power somehow. You could still get around somewhat, and so it wasn't anything like what some folks are experiencing right now, but it was a taste of it.
For sure. I was just thinking, you've talked often about the story about when your dad lined the 1 ton with plastic and filled it with water. That's the same time, right?
Yeah, it was ingenious. We didn't have water for weeks, and FEMA was trucking water in gallon jugs. And so the whole city was dependent upon FEMA to bring them their very water to drink. And Dad was like, enough of this. And so we had this big flatbed with stake sides, and we lined it with plywood and some polyethylene, and went out to some folks that he had built their house, and it was out in the country, and they had a well, and they had water. And imagine that.
Yeah.
And they said, sure, you can get water from our well. And so we stuck the hose in there and filled it up until the springs were about bottomed out, and drove home and nearly wiped out, because if you've ever driven a truck with that
full of water
that's splashing around, you can understand why they have bladders in these tanks. And it was not a tank, it was just an open bed. So yeah, just about lost it around one corner, but made it home, and threw a little sump pump in the back of the truck and hooked it up to the hose bib of the house, and we had water.
That's awesome.
But yeah, it was things like this that have been instructional over the years. And whenever something like this happens, it's such a terrible thing. And you want to try and somehow find some good that can come out of it. And, it's difficult to find good for those that are involved. But if, at the very least, if the rest of us, if all of us can learn from this situation some things that we could do so that if we were ever involved in a situation like that, we might be in a better position, then at least maybe it's not completely all for naught,
Yeah, I was just thinking about those folks whose homes just completely washed away, and now they're left looking for help from others, and thinking about the others that, are they still have their homes, and but they're not in much of a better position to help those folks who don't have a home anymore.
They have no power, no water.
Exactly.
The food in their fridge and freezer are going bad.
Yeah.
And even if they had a generator, they're running out of gas. That's assuming the generator actually started and the gas that they had on hand was okay. Yeah. And if they can even make it to a gas station, it probably doesn't have power to get gas. And if it does have power, then they're rationing the gas to like $25, which nowadays is maybe 10 gallons. But anyhow, yeah, if you believe in Bible prophecy, as we do, I'd say that this is to be expected. I mean, yes, there's always storms, and every now and then you're setting records. So I'm not trying to say that this is something that never happens, but I think that we can expect to see
more and more
unheard
events
of
like this.
Yeah, unheard of record-breaking storms and natural disasters increase in frequency and intensity as we near the end. So yes, there's always been disasters and there always will be, but I expect to see more intensity and more frequency. And so the question from a very practical standpoint is, what are some takeaways from this that the rest of us can learn from this? So takeaways.
Yes.
One takeaway for me was that every area has its potential hazards.
Yeah.
And some of those hazards are not something that happen all the time.
Mm-hmm.
This, like I said earlier, this area was deemed relatively safe. Western North Carolina was thought to be one of those places where there's not a lot of bad things that happen. It wasn't a Florida that gets hurricanes coming through all the time. It's not a California that gets earthquakes. It's not a Western U.S. that gets wildfires. It was an area that you felt like you weren't going to have too much by way of major disasters, maybe a tornado now and then and a little flooding, but that was about it. But it happened. And think about it, what could happen even if it doesn't happen all the time? Like for us, the natural disaster in our neck of the woods that is the most likely would be a wildland fire.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we have to be open to the potential that we could have a serious earthquake.
Mm-hmm.
It's not likely. I think I've only felt one here, and it was just so subtle that I didn't even know it was an earthquake until it was
Took me
reported.
a minute to figure it out.
It was reported in the news the next day or something, and it was like,
I did feel that.
Yeah, but still, I think that is within the realm of possibility. And another thing, this is an area that we almost never have a tornado, but we did have one that touched down 10, 12 years ago. And so it's possible. It can happen. So just realize that even if it's not something that happens all the time, it can happen. And just keep that in the back of your mind. Not that we got to be paranoid, but just don't close that possibility off when you're thinking of your preparedness plans.
Yeah, another one is don't build down in the lowlands or in the bottom of the valleys. If you own property where you do have a nice valley or lowlands, look around and see if you can't build up higher so that way you're up and out of that potential flooding zone. I think about the parable, the wise man built his house, up on the rock.
Yep.
That's just, common sense and wisdom. And so think about that when you look around you and consider the possibilities of different challenges you might face in your area.
And even those of you that are in town, we're going to do our best to talk you into moving out into a rural area as soon as possible, as soon as it's feasible for you to do so. But in the meantime, think about where your little house, if you're looking for a condo or an apartment or whatever, look for the lay of the land. If there's a river or a creek nearby and it's kind of in a low area, and in terms of flooding, then think about that and think, but well, maybe we could, if you have the option, find another spot that's up out of those lowlands. And that's just considering the floods. We're looking at takeaways from this particular disaster. There's all kinds of disasters have their own takeaways, but we're focusing particularly on this flooding situation.
Like wildfires, one thing we've talked a lot about because of where we live is that when you're dealing with a potential wildfire threat, right, you want to make sure you clear plenty of space around your home so that the trees aren't right up and over top your home. There's a lot of benefits to it, but the biggest one, especially for us, is having the trees far away from the house gives us a greater chance of
space.
Saving our home.
Yeah.
So things like that. We're talking about floods right now because of what's going on in back east, but we need to think about the potentials in our area too.
Yeah, that's right. Really the next few have to do with water, because that's what you hear a lot about, that one of the biggest struggles folks are having, because when you get in one of these situations, you start to realize what are your basic necessities. Have you ever heard that before on this podcast?
Every podcast.
And water is one of the most fundamental ones that you can have. And so ideally, you'd like to have your own water source, for instance, a well. Mm-hmm. And, if you do have a well as a water source, then you want to be able to power the well pump reliably. And there are a number of options for that, but the most common one would be a generator with plenty of fuel and exercising it regularly, maintaining it regularly so that it will hopefully function when you need it.
And stabilizing the fuel so it doesn't go bad.
Yes, if it's a gas or diesel generator, yes. So being able to power your well pump reliably, or else having a solid hand pump on that well so that you can pump water out of that, or both. Ideally would be both, to have a hand pump on there and to have a means of powering the pump so that you've got the more convenient option. And if that breaks down, then you've got some redundancy where you could always go and pump the water by hand. That would be ideal, so that your water is more of a sure thing.
Just think, if every well that was ever built had a hand pump installed on it, how much more accessible water would be in this country. No matter where you go, you run across a property and there's a well, there's a hand pump. Yeah. And so in a disaster, you have access to water whether there's power or not.
Right. By the way, we just released a course in the Ready Life Academy on hand pumps, walking you step by step through how to pick the right hand pump and figure out whether you want to install it yourself or choose an installer and find them, and just going through the whole process. So definitely check that out if you are interested, if you're in that kind of a position where you have a well and you'd like to put a hand pump on it.
Yes.
But redundancy is a really, really important thing. And speaking of redundancy, I'm a little bit OCD about water, because even if you have a means to power your well pump and a hand pump on there, I'd still like you to have a good water filter on hand, just in case. You got to have water. And redundancy is so important. And so unless you're on the edge of the wilderness with no developed areas between you and the watershed, plan on any creeks or rivers to be terribly polluted during a flood. We were talking about that earlier. Toxic mess. You're going to want a good filter if you had to deal with any kind of water like that.
And speaking of a water filter, while he was just talking, that made me think of a podcast that we just recently did about our car and some of the things that we like to keep in our car. And a water filter is one of the items we like to keep in our car because, maybe you weren't home when the storm hit. In fact, that's happened just this last week. We were actually in town when a really bad storm blew through. Yeah. And if we were unable to get home for some reason, whatever that reason might be, and we were stuck in a position where we couldn't get back home and power was out and we couldn't access water anywhere, we have a water filter, a small one, but it's still a water filter in the back of our car all the time.
And a supply of water too.
So yeah, and we have an extra supply of water. So if you haven't seen that podcast, you'll want to go watch that, because
there's also one on water purification too.
Yes.
That's number 68, I believe. And I'm trying to remember which. I think it was just last week's podcast was the one about our car.
No, I think that was
it was 2 weeks
2-minute
ago.
bug out bag. Yeah,
that's right.
So anyhow, having water is such a kingpin. There's a lot you can do. You can survive a while in the colds, and you can survive a while without eating, but you can't survive very long without water. So
depending on the conditions, though, the cold could take you out quicker than water. But if it's a warmer temperature, then water is going to be the top priority.
Yeah. But there's still even things you can do in the cold to keep yourself going for a while. But anyway, yes, point taken.
So if you don't have a well, because we were kind of focusing on if you do have a well, but I realize a lot of you probably don't have a well. So some things, have a sizable stash of water storage on hand in food grade containers. And if you're going to keep those on hand, then you're going to want to treat them periodically and change the water periodically to prevent growth inside the containers. And, bleach is the officially recommended treatment. The government agencies, they've got some recommendations. We've got that in our podcast on water purification, the recommended amount of bleach. For the more health conscious among you, a lot of folks, or some folks, might try hydrogen peroxide or colloidal silver. And I'm not going to say that those do or don't work. Just realize that neither of those methods have been studied as much. So you're, a little bit more on your own there as far as, what concentration, how long it'll keep it, what kind of growth it knocks down, that sort of thing. Bleach is the standard. But anyway, whatever you're going to use, have some water on hand. And if you have the water filter, maybe that water's been sitting there for a while, you could run it through your water filter then. Yeah. And then you're good, So the beauty of having a water filter.
I remember whenever a storm would come through when I was a kid, my mom would run to the bathroom, plug the bathtub up, and fill it all the way up with water. So we would have water for maybe flushing toilet or whatever it might be. But yeah, water is really important.
So food, having a solid pantry on hand, a rotating pantry would be ideal. And by rotating pantry, I mean eat what you store and store what you eat. So having a supply of the foods that you eat on hand, and you eat from your pantry and replace what you're eating so that you keep it fresh. And it works really, really well that way. We actually have a whole course on that in the Ready Life Academy.
Just going to say, early this year, we went through and did a whole food storage planning course where we walked through how to plan a food storage program that is tailored to meet your needs. And we also looked at factors like, for example, not using the freezer quite so much. A lot of people will put their food up and put it in the freezer to store.
And that's our next point on the list, actually.
Oh, is it? Yeah. Okay. So if are you storing your food in primarily freezer form, or are you diversifying dramatically and using more of like dehydration or canning or, root cellaring or things like that? There's so many different options for storing food that go beyond just your refrigerator and your freezer. So those are things to consider when you're thinking about putting up the harvest from your garden, if you live in the country or even if you live in town and you're like, I need to get a food supply on hand. Don't just go and fill up a deep freeze, because when the power goes out, you're going to be in a bad place having to run the generator all the time to try and keep the freezer from thawing.
Yeah. So, and like we read in that news article at the beginning, there was somebody that had a freezer full of venison and they were feeding the whole neighborhood before it went bad.
Yeah.
Which, that's great that they were able to feed the neighborhood, but there goes their whole supply of food that they had there.
So that's something to think about when you're thinking about storing your food.
Yes. And, if you are able to reliably make your own power with like an off-grid solar power system, then you might feel comfortable putting more into freezer storage. But even still, freezers themselves can go bad on you. And if it goes out during a time when you are not around to hear the buzzer going off on the freezer or something like that, then you could lose a big chunk of food and take a big hit financially. Just be careful with that.
Yes.
So if there's any chance of floodwater or fire or another disaster hitting quickly, it's a really good idea to have a bug out kit assembled.
Yes.
That's our previous podcast.
Last week's podcast.
And because then you're ready to go so that you can at least have some essentials with you. And I have little doubt that there were many people during this storm that weren't expecting the water to get as high as it did. And then there came a point in time at which they were like, oh my, we got to get out of here
now.
And they probably had literally minutes, if not seconds, to get out of there before it was too late. And then they were stuck in their house, climbing up on their roof. And if it got if it swept away their house or got high enough, then they were gone and they were, lost. So being able to have what you need and be able to grab it and get in the car in 2 minutes flat is really, really important if you're in that kind of a situation.
Can be life-changing for you.
Yeah.
Yeah. And a survival kit in your car. We just talked about that a minute ago.
Yep.
Having just the basic necessities. It doesn't have to be something that fills up the whole of your back car. In fact, we spent a little bit of time talking about that in our podcast a couple weeks ago. But I just have to say, I love having an electric chainsaw on the back of my car, especially since we live in the country. We did that podcast 2 weeks ago. We had the storm blow through, and what do you know? We were cutting our way back into our home with our wonderful little chainsaw, and we were home within minutes because of it. So go watch the podcast.
Yes, it was nice to not have to Paul Bunyan it with an axe.
Yes, which is what we did for many years until we got an electric chainsaw.
That's right. Another thought that hit me was to know the back roads in your area, especially all the bridges and even the little bridges and things like that, in case that your familiar routes around are closed. If you know the back roads or have really good maps, paper maps, because your phone battery can die, or if it's dependent upon a cell signal, cell phones have been knocked out in that area for the most part. They say you can hardly use a phone, especially for data. And so if you know the back roads, you might just be able to find a way, a little known way around and be able to clear out of the area and get where you need to go.
Yes. Yes. So have a means of communication that's not dependent on your landline or cell towers. Could be satellite-based internet like Starlink. In fact, the video that we were just watching was from someone in and around the Asheville area. And the reason he was able to post a video online was because guess what?
He had Starlink.
That's right. Yeah. He had Starlink and he was running his generator so he could power up his Starlink, call his family, say, hey, I'm okay, whatever. And having something like that is really valuable.
That's just one option. Any of the satellite-based options could work, or even a satellite-based texting device like a bivy stick or one of those spot trackers that backpackers or outdoor enthusiasts will use. That could enable you to be able to send a message out to family that you're okay, or to send an SOS message. If you weren't able to get out of your house and the water was rising and you needed a rescue crew to come, that could be a way to get a message out. It's not ideal, but it could work. And even some newer cell phones have the ability to do that. Like, for instance, there may be others that I'm not aware of, but the ones I'm aware of are iPhone 14 and later models. They are supposedly able to send a SOS message via satellite if you don't have a cell signal. And it's very limited. I'm not sure how it all works because I have an iPhone 8. So
we're a little bit in ancient history here.
But yeah, so I'm not sure of all the details. I don't think you can just text anybody. I think you're limited to just sending a SOS message to the basically dispatch to 911. But that's better than nothing. And so that's a pretty cool option. Or any of your radio-based options, like, for instance, ham radio. If the people that you need to talk to are hams and set up, then that could work. CBs, they can go for a little ways if you have a really good antenna and the most power that you can get. And I will leave it at that. Wink, wink, you know what I mean? Plenty of power. The most power you can get could be very helpful in an emergency. And not advocating anything illegal here. And GMRS, FRS radios. The nice thing about CBs is that they are pretty widely used. And so you're going to be, reasonably likely, if you go through the 40 channels, to find somebody. If you're getting the signal out there a ways, then you're going to be reasonably likely for somebody to hear you. That might not be the case on some less used mediums, but with any of these, the obvious point is you got to have somebody that you're needing to talk to that's actually listening for you and can hear you.
Yes.
But those are all options to think about. And I think it's a great idea for friends in the area to create a network, a comms network,
Yes.
where when something like this happens, you already know who you can connect with via your radio, and you all have a designated channel and maybe a designated time of day that you're listening, where you could, you even if you could only connect with one member of your group, then they could relay the message to other people. And, that could be really handy, either a neighborhood group or group of friends in the general area or whatever. So radio comms are awesome as long as you do some groundwork ahead of time, because radio comms are the only thing that is not dependent on any outside resources.
Yeah.
So really, really valuable in that. What else? Oh, vehicles.
Oh, yes. Higher clearance vehicles.
Yep. Especially like a 4-wheel drive could be helpful in getting around in the rough conditions that often exist during a disaster. Whether it be flooding, whether it be water, mud, whatever. You don't want to get too confident, because you go in, doesn't matter how high your vehicle is or whether it's 4-wheel drive or not. If you drive into water that's too deep, you're gonna be in a bad place. So you still have to be careful, but it gives you a better chance of getting through things like that, or mud, or just rough conditions that can be encountered during a disaster. Or even an ATV or a UTV can be really, really useful. Some people in this storm have been getting around in their UTVs and stuff like that. So that can be a blessing. And like we read, mules. They're even using mules
I loved
to
that.
pack stuff around.
200 pounds on the back of a mule and up you go.
Yep. So a lot of lessons to be learned. For those of you in the Southern Appalachians and Florida that got hit, and the coast, our hearts go out to you, and we send you our thoughts and prayers, and hope you're able to get back on your feet, and all of that. And our hope is that the rest of us can benefit and get into a better place where a situation like this hopefully won't be so devastating the next time.
Yes.
Anyway, hope y'all have a good rest of your week, and we'll see you next week.
Bye.
Bye.